Okay, so once your camera is in manual mode, and I'm going a little bit ahead of myself by pretending your camera is already there, but I think this is important to talk about first before we get your camera into manual mode. You're going to be able to change many aspects of your camera, but most importantly, you are going to control the exposure of that image. So what you're going to be controlling is your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. And I'm going to go over what all three of those are now and how you control them and what effects they're going to have on your image. So your ISO is the measure of the sensor's sensitivity to light. Right now I'm going to skip over that because it's something that I don't change often unless necessary. But I'll tell you when we will change that. What you're going to do, or then you have your shutter speed, and your shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open. So, for instance, you can literally physically hear your shutter speed. Here mine is 1/2500. You can hear that was pretty fast. I'm going to take it down to, call it 3. So you can physically hear what your shutter speed is. Now your aperture is the size of the opening in the lens when the actual picture is taken. Now your shutter speed and aperture are very powerful tools in creating something that goes from boring to wow. So let's move a little bit further into understanding kind of what your shutter speed and your aperture are. If you think of your camera as a window, your aperture is how big the window is. So aperture can be somewhat confusing because your aperture, the numbers are inversely proportional. So an aperture of 1.4, 1.8, 2.0, those apertures make the opening huge, which is allowing in a ton of light. So let's say your aperture is 1.4. This window is gigantic, and it's letting in a ton of light. Now what happens when your aperture is 1.4? You're going to get a super blurry background. You're going to get that depth of field that is just fantastic. You're going to have that image in the front. Let's just pretend it's a pen, and the whole background, you won't even be able to see what the background is, okay? So that's where aperture can come in very useful into understanding how to create your images the way that you want them to be. Now your shutter speed is the amount of time that you actually have your shutters open. So again, you open and close them really fast, not a lot of light gets through. If you open and close them slowly, a lot of light gets through. So let's go over some caveats of each one of these before we get into changing them on your camera. Your aperture, again, is how big that window is. The smaller the aperture, okay, f1.8, the larger the opening. So you get a ton of light coming in. So f1.8. Now, I know it gets a little tricky to remember this in the beginning, but your lower numbered aperture, a lot of light comes in, the blurrier the background, okay? So that's down here. You have, well, that's a little cheat sheet then that I put in here. The blurrier the background, a ton of light comes in. The smaller the aperture, or an f10, not as much light is coming in, okay? So where people mainly want to be that are trying to take these classes, if you've seen my work, I work at a very small aperture. So if you're taking my class because you like my work, this is where you're going to end up working at. So again, your smaller your aperture, the larger the opening, the more light comes in, the blurrier the background. And we're going to do understanding this whole thing with an exercise then. Now your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is, again, how fast that those shutters are opening and closing. So if you have a fast shutter speed, let's say 1/200 seconds, that's that, you heard it very quickly, you know. it doesn't let in a ton of light, but it also captures motion. 1/15 seconds, you are letting in more light, but the motion is not captured. You can see how there's more light to this background, and this background's a little bit darker. Your shutter speed becomes extraordinarily important when you are working with changing your aperture. And what you want to do is figure out the image that you want. If you want that blurry background, you're going to have to keep your aperture at a lower number. You're going to have to keep your aperture at 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, and then adjust your shutter speed around it. So we're going to actually do that. But before we do that, I'm going to get you to understand your camera and how to actually change those settings on your camera. Now, everybody's camera is different. So once everybody sends me what they have, I think that that'll be really useful, and I'll send you a video back of how to do it. But this is the example of the Nikon D80. And you know what? I'm going to stop this video now and start this.